A fire can eat away at flesh in just seconds, but the fear, the shame, and the hopelessness, those feelings linger far longer. Most people know how Joan of Arc lost her life. They picture flames, thick smoke, a young woman tied to a stake, consumed in a public spectacle, while cries of "heretic" bounce off the stone walls of Roan's marketplace. But what they don't often think about, what we rarely consider, are the moments before. Before the fire, there was silence. Before the flames, there were chains. And before the crowd gathered to witness her death, they were already breaking her down, piece by piece, with cold precision. Joan's execution is usually seen as a moment of religious injustice, a brave girl burned by men afraid of what they couldn't control. But the truth is even darker. She wasn't merely condemned, she was shattered, not just by the English or the church, but by a system designed to strip her of dignity, piece by piece. What if death wasn't the worst part? What if the greatest horror wasn't the fire that ended her life, but the slow psychological torment that came before? What if the flames were just the final punctuation mark in a sentence filled with intimidation, violation, spiritual deprivation, and calculated fear? Joan was just 19 years old. By the time those flames licked at her bare feet, she'd already survived a brutal campaign of degradation that today would be labeled state-sanctioned torture. She wasn't given a fair trial. She wasn't protected as a prisoner. She was a teenage girl, shackled to her bed at night, denied basic religious rights, interrogated without a break, threatened with torture devices, and terrorized by guards who saw her as less than human, as a prophet, not as a woman, but as property. The official story calls it a trial. History books label it heresy. But strip away the fancy words, and what you find is simple. This was a ritual destruction of a young woman who had dared to challenge authority. What you're about to hear isn't the myth of Joan of Arc, Saint of France. It isn't the polished version sung in hymns or taught in Sunday schools. This is the part we tend to forget: the hidden torture before the flames. She's known as the Maid of Orleans, a visionary, a saint, a warrior girl who changed a kingdom's fate. And when people talk about her end, it's often with a kind of tragic reverence. Joan of Arc burned at the stake for heresy, a martyr. Joan of Arc is often seen as a misunderstood hero. But even that version of her story is distorted. It makes her death sound noble and clean. In reality, nothing about her last year was noble or clean. What's truly misunderstood is the depth of her suffering. The tale we're taught goes like this. Joan, guided by divine visions, leads the French army to victory. She crowns a king and beats the odds, but she gets captured by the English, wrongly tried for heresy, and executed in a brutal act of revenge. That story isn't completely wrong, but it's missing a lot. What most textbooks overlook is everything that happened between her capture and the day her body was burned. Nearly a whole year passed, and during that time, Joan faced more than just prison. She went through systematic, soul-crushing psychological torture. This wasn't a fair trial. It was a carefully planned demolition of her spirit. They didn't just want to kill Joan, they wanted to discredit and humiliate her. They aimed to erase her memory from the hearts of people and from God. They wanted to break her so thoroughly that by the time she reached the scaffold, she'd be unrecognizable, both in body and soul. What makes Joan's story even more chilling is that this was all intentional. Her captors, interrogators, and judges knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just want her dead, they wanted her to break down, to beg, to recant, to wear feminine clothes. They aimed to turn the girl who spoke with saints into someone scared, vulnerable, and shattered. If they could succeed, they wouldn't just eliminate a girl. They'd destroy a powerful symbol. And that is why her suffering matters. Joan was dangerous, not because she carried a sword, but because she refused to conform. She was a young peasant girl in men's armor, talking to kings without asking for permission. She heard voices she believed were heavenly, and led men into battle, not through force, but through her strong conviction. To her enemies, that wasn't just heresy, it was insubordination. And in 15th century Europe, insubordinate women didn't get trials. They faced public spectacles. What followed her capture was anything but mercy. In 1430, one of the biggest court debacles in medieval times unfolded. Joan was captured by the Burgundians, who were allies of the English. Sold like she was property, she was handed over to a force that already decided her fate. There was no chance for a fair trial, no hope for mercy. Joan had embarrassed the powerful, outshone the nobles, and worst of all, she had done it as a woman. This story isn't just about the flames. It's not enough to say she was burned. Long before the fire, Joan faced lies, threats, hunger, mockery, interrogation, betrayal, and utter isolation in a system set up to break her down from the inside. The flames took her body, but it was the months of fear, loneliness, and treachery that truly killed her. Forget the image of the saintly figure on a horse. This is the Joan in chains, lost in darkness, questioning if the voices she heard were real or just madness from her suffering. This is the forgotten Joan, the one broken long before she met the flames. Her downfall didn't start at the stake, it began with betrayal. On May 23, 1430, Joan was pulled off her horse outside Campine. She had tried to defend the town, but the gates closed before she could get back in. Captured by the Burgundians, she wasn't treated as a prisoner of war, but as a political trophy for the English. Joan wasn't just a warrior, she was a threat to their empire, disguised as a peasant girl. They paid 10,000 Libraza kings ransom for her not to question her, but to erase her. When she reached Rouen, controlled by the English, it wasn't to a royal chamber or even a noble's prison. Church law didn't apply. Instead, she was thrown into a military prison, watched by 5 male soldiers who were not friendly. They were ordered to keep her chained and monitored day and night. The room wasn't a quiet cell for reflection. It was a grim tower, damp and smelling of rot, urine, and old blood. Light trickled in through a narrow stone slit, no view. Just a blurry reminder that the world existed beyond her punishment. Chained to a wooden beam, her ankles were shackled, and her arms often. At night, they bound her to a wooden plank, nailed right into the stone floor. She couldn't move, no pacing, no kneeling to pray, not even rolling over in her sleep. Her freedom was replaced by rusted iron. Dignity was gone, with guards leering at her, making their thoughts very clear. Joan wasn't just a prisoner, she was a trophy, and the men watching her acted like it. Witnesses described the verbal abuse, the constant jeering, and threats of assault. On multiple occasions, Joan reported the guards trying to attack her. She begged to be moved to a church-run prison or to be looked after by women. They refused. Forced to wear men's clothing, it wasn't a defiant act, like the prosecution later claimed. It was a desperate attempt to protect herself. Her soldier's tunic and tight leggings made it harder for the guards to reach her. But this self-defense was twisted into proof of her supposed heresy. This wasn't just confinement, it was brutal degradation. She was cut off from everyone who once stood by her. No priest came to hear her confessions, and no friends were allowed to visit. Isolated from her faith community, she was left with men who thought of her as a madwoman, a fraud, or worse, a woman who had dared to lead men into battle and win. And she was only 19. Every morning, Joan woke in that freezing cell, facing the same grim question: would today bring torture, burning, or being left to rot? This wasn't random chaos, it was a deliberate strategy. The English crown couldn't risk executing a French national hero without first breaking her credibility. They aimed to shatter her sanity instead. Joan was denied basic religious comforts. They withheld the Eucharist and often blocked her from attending Mass. It was torturous for a girl whose identity was built on devotion. This wasn't just punishment, it was psychological warfare, and it was effective. By the end of her first month in Rouen, Joan began to hallucinate. She described seeing St. Catherine, not in radiant beauty, but weeping, her voice distant and muffled. This wasn't a divine vision, it was a mind unraveling under pressure. Historical records, mainly from English sources, painted Joan as stubborn, wild, and uncontrollable. But what they really meant was that she hadn't yet broken. Make no mistake, the goal was clear. They didn't just want to hold Joan, they wanted to break her down. They aimed to strip away her identity, her confidence, her connection with God. They took a girl who was sure of her divine mission and left her questioning everything, her visions, her virtue, even her virginity. The battle against Joan wasn't fought with swords. No, it was fought with damp straw bedding, shackled ankles, and men whispering filthy things in the dark. And this was just the start. After the chains and the solitude came something even worse, the trial. That's where the real torture began. Not of the body, but of the mind and soul. There's a certain cruelty reserved for women who defy authority. For Joan of Arc, this cruelty came in many forms: physical, psychological, spiritual, but it wasn't random. Each act was rooted in a simple truth. The English couldn't handle that Joan was a girl who didn't act like one. She wore armor. She commanded men. She gave orders to nobles, bishops, and even royalty. She claimed to hear the voice of God, and people believed her. That was her true crime, not heresy or sorcery. It was the crime of disobedience in a world that wanted women to be quiet, submissive, and invisible. So when they finally had her in chains, their aim was not just to end her life, they wanted to take back control over her womanhood. The first weapon? Isolation from other women. Joan wasn't kept in a convent or under the watch of nuns, as the rules required for female prisoners. No, she was locked away in a military prison guarded by men, with no women around to offer comfort, safety, or dignity. This wasn't just a violation of church law, it was deliberate violence against her gender. Those men weren't just keeping her captive, they were there to remind her constantly of what she was: a girl, a prisoner, a body. Historical records show her constant fear of rape. She begged time and again for the judges to place her in the care of women. She didn't ask for mercy or freedom, she just wanted basic safety. But she never got it. To protect herself, she kept wearing men's clothing, a padded tunic, hose, and tightly bound leggings to make it harder for men to violate her. Ironically, that act of resistance became the main piece of evidence in her heresy trial. Let that sink in. Joan was accused of sin because she tried to avoid being raped. During the interrogation, the judges asked her why she still wore men's clothing. Her answer was straightforward. It was safer and more proper to dress like a man when surrounded by men. They laughed at her. To them, being modest wasn't about virtue, it was rebellion. And rebellion, in Joan's case, was treason. They offered her a deal: forsake your male clothes, bow to the church's authority, confess that your voices were a lie, and you could live. This was a twisted choice: to reject your identity or face the fire. Even her visions, those of St. Catherine, St. Margaret, and the Archangel Michael, were turned against her. Instead of divine messengers, they called them female madness, or, at worst, witchcraft. A woman hearing voices couldn't be a prophet. She was either crazy or possessed. The trial transcripts show the questions growing more personal and invasive. They asked about her virginity, her past with men, childhood memories, and even her periods. They weren't looking for truth. They wanted to dismantle her sense of self. Joan was no longer seen as a brave soldier or a visionary. She was merely a woman who had stepped out of line. Day by day, her interrogators aimed to break her down, using shame and repetition. Imagine being just 19, never having loved anyone, fully devoted to what you believed was a divine mission. Now, there you are, surrounded by older men, scholars and clergy, forced to justify your very existence. Their questions weren't innocent, they were weapons. And despite her courage, Joan started to waver. Witnesses noted her trembling hands during the longer sessions. She cried. She prayed out loud in court. She pleaded not to be left alone at night with the guards. But nothing eased her situation. To them, she was no longer a person but a symbol to tear apart, a woman to serve as a warning. Her only sin was her power, and in a woman, that was seen as heresy. By the time Joan of Arc entered the courtroom in Rouen, her fate was all but sealed. What happened during those long cold months of 1431 wasn't a real trial. It was a scripted show. The purpose wasn't to find the truth, but to justify a murder. The courtroom was not filled with fair judges, but with English sympathizers chosen to support the outcome they wanted. At the center of this was Bishop Pierre Causson, a man more focused on his political ambitions than on caring for people. He owed his position to the English crown, and he knew that executing Joan would secure his loyalty. There were over 70 charges against her at first. 70 ridiculous accusations: heresy, sorcery, demon worship, blasphemy, dressing like a man, claiming to hear divine voices, disobeying her parents, and even breaking the commandment to honor church authority. It was a jumbled and frantic list, thrown together not to seek justice but to overwhelm her. The sheer number of accusations was their first tactic. Confusion was their control method. Joan stood alone in the courtroom, with no lawyer, no advocate, and no translator. Latin was the court's language, but she was just a teenage peasant girl, barely able to read. Facing a panel of educated theologians and interrogation experts, most of them viewed her as a liar, a fraud, a heretic, and above all, a threat. Yet, she held her ground. Despite being exhausted, scared, and isolated, Joan's replies were sharp, even brilliant. When asked if she believed she was in a state of grace, a trap meant to ensnare her, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me that way." It was a clever response that left the court speechless. They wanted her to falter, but she outsmarted them. However, sheer brilliance wasn't enough to save her. This court didn't care about the truth. They wanted a confession. So they shifted their approach from questioning to playing mind games. The trial sessions dragged on for hours. Joan was often kept awake, pulled from her cell at dawn for interrogations that lasted until dusk, then thrown back into her chained bed. They even brought in doctors to check her for witches' marks like birthmarks or blemishes they could call satanic, but found nothing. Still, they continued searching, more interested in drama than facts. The interrogations were designed to trap her in contradictions. They asked the same questions over and over, just rephrased, hoping fatigue would crack her memory. They probed about her visions, asking if they were dreams or real, when they occurred, and in what language they spoke. They even wanted her to describe the angels, what they looked like, what they wore, how their hair was styled. These weren't serious theological inquiries, they were traps. And throughout this ordeal, Joan remained alone in that cold, stone cell. Chained and barely fed, Joan had no one to talk to. No priest to hear her confession, no friend to reassure her that she wasn't losing her mind. This wasn't a trial, it was an attack on her spirit. They weren't just testing her innocence, they aimed to break her down until she shattered. When her interrogators saw she wouldn't crumble under their theological questioning, they switched to fear. On March 10th, 1431, they dragged her before a special tribunal, not in a courtroom, not in her cell, but in a place meant to scare her, the torture chamber, surrounded by racks, pulleys, iron, instruments, the tools of agony. They made a simple choice: confess and live, resist and suffer. Joan glanced around at devices built to inflict pain, the hooks, the wheels, and the strappado that could dislocate shoulders. They asked her, "Are you afraid of these instruments?" She boldly replied, "I fear nothing but treason." But deep down, she felt fear creeping in. Here's the chilling part. She wasn't physically tortured, not because they showed mercy, but because they didn't have to. The mere threat of torture, the terrifying atmosphere, the show they put on was more powerful than any blade. It was pure terror. And it worked. Joan broke down in tears and trembled. She promised she wouldn't lie, even if it meant death. So, they sent her back to her cell, still intact, but now fully aware of how far they'd go. From then on, the trial wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was a test of endurance. How long could she withstand this? And how long would they let it go on? Medieval torture wasn't always about hurting the body. Sometimes It was about the fear of what could happen. The rack didn't always need to turn. The chains didn't need to snap bones. All they had to do was promise pain, slowly and deliberately. For Joan of Arc, the threat of torture was already punishment enough. March 10th, 1431. Joan found herself in a vaulted room below the main hall, no longer surrounded by judges in robes, but by silent executioners, hooded and professional. Before her lay the strappado, the rack, and other gleaming instruments displayed like a terrifying collection. Surgical tools? This wasn't a court, it was a stage, and Joan was the main act. Bishop Pierre Cachon played his final card, saying, "You'll face these instruments unless you tell the truth." The truth. What did that even mean for them? Joan's truth was clear. She heard voices, followed them, and they led her to battles, victories, and even a crown. But now, they wanted her to admit it was all a lie. Joan didn't confess. Not even when the executioners came closer. Not even when she saw the ropes that could tear her arms apart. Not even when exhaustion, hunger, and grief weighed her down. Witnesses noted how she looked, pale, trembling, lips quivering, tears falling. But still, she stood firm. Then, the judges tried something clever. They stepped back. Not out of pity, but because they realized something chilling. They didn't need to hurt her. They just had to let her sit with her fear. Joan was sent back to her cell, untouched, but haunted by every violent image. And it worked. The girl who once faced kings now lay on a cold stone floor, imagining the rope, the crunch of bones, the fire waiting beneath her. Today, this is called anticipatory trauma. It's where the body relives pain that hasn't struck yet. Joan had survived battles and chaos, but what loomed ahead was worse: silence. The dread of knowing she could be called at any moment, not to speak, but to scream. This was pure psychological torture. Not the pain of action, but the torment of what could happen. And it didn't stop there. The judges came more often, not to ask questions, but to torment her with hints. "You look tired. Pain steals sleep. You could avoid this suffering, Joan. Just admit the voices were false. There's still time." But not much. This wasn't a real conversation. It was a mental siege. They were building a cage, not of iron, but of doubt. Would the torturer come tonight? Would she be yanked from her cell again? Would the church really allow this? Had God abandoned her? Every time Joan closed her eyes, the ropes were there. Every prayer was drowned out by the imagined creak of pulleys. Every whisper outside her cell could be the end. You could hear the guard coming to get her. They didn't use tools to break her, they used time. Slowly, her mental defenses started to crumble. The records show hints of doubt, unfinished prayers, and moments where she openly questioned if her voices had gone silent because of her sins. It's easy to think of Joan as someone who never wavered, but the reality is much sadder. She wavered, she struggled, she was afraid. And that makes her suffering feel more real, not less. She wasn't some statue. She was a young girl. The fear she faced in those final weeks wasn't just a thought, it was real, vivid, and non-stop. When people talk about her bravery, they often overlook this side of her story. The quiet horror of facing torture over and over, where fear becomes like a second heartbeat. She didn't crumble under the sword. She broke from the fear of what was coming. And that was the whole plan all along.